All right, everybody, welcome to our Digital Humanism lecture series. It's a particular pleasure today to present you Wessel Reyes. He is a former colleague of mine and a philosopher. Despite the fact that digital humanism is sometimes considered a very philosophical discipline, we do actually not have that many professional philosophers who give talks in our circle here. So it's a real pleasure having you. Welcome, Wessel. Wessel will be talking about something that perhaps from just the title may not make a lot of sense to the computer scientists in the group, and I hope Wessel is going to explain it. The talk will be about civic virtue and digital technology. And I guess he'll explain this in more detail. But let me first say a few things about Wessel. Wessel is a philosopher of technology. He has been working on the intersection between empirically informed philosophy and ethics of technology. So I think that's worth pointing out because he actually also has been doing some empirical work. He also works in normative ethics and responsible innovation. He used to work a lot about philosophical hermeneutics and the work of Paul Ricoeur. When you see his list of publications, you'll see quite a bit about blockchain and blockchain ethics and that sort of thing, but also social credit systems. Wessel promised me, however, there's no China bashing planned for today, so we'll see how that works and what Wessel is going to say about this. But Wessel has published a lot on the Chinese social credit systems, the governance of blockchain technologies, also the work of Hannah Arendt for responsible innovation. And he has co-authored a monograph entitled Narrative and Technology Ethics, together with Mark Kogelberg, who works here in Vienna. In his free time, Wessel likes to play and compose music. And that's something to which we will return towards the end of the lecture. As you know, there is always a piece of music ending our lecture series. And today, I can already tell you it's going to be a piece by Wessel. But before that, welcome, Wessel. It's very good to have you. As usual, we'll have like a 30 minutes presentation from your side. Then I'll moderate some Q&A, and then we'll do a few announcements and the piece of music at the end. Wessel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eeg, and thank you for the really wonderful announcement. I don't think I ever had such a wonderful announcement, so thank you very much. And it's really great to be here with you on this afternoon. Most of you are in Austria, I think. I'm in Hamburg at the moment. No? Oh, it's like a very mixed group. So Austria and other places. So probably where you are, it's warmer than where I am. It's quite cold here. But that's actually a very good setting to be fresh and start a talk. So I will start with sharing my slides. So just tell me whether you can see this. You can see it. Okay, that's wonderful. So let me just start with sketching a little bit the background here. As Erik already said, so I've done a bunch of projects, you could say like empirically informed philosophy or empirically informed ethics, where I've been looking more into concrete systems that are being used. So for example, in the distributed technologies, but also the Chinese social credit system that are used in governance, generally speaking. In these works, I've also engaged with philosophy, legal philosophy, political philosophy. For example, in the kind of blockchain setting, I've looked at like legal philosophy discourses between people like Carl Schmitt and Hans Kelsen. So there has been philosophy involved, but this work reflects a little bit more, or what I'm going to present today is a bit more of an overarching theme that I think came out of these different works, which seem quite unrelated, because if you think about blockchain technology, it's like this like libertarian technology that comes out of largely comes out of the Silicon Valley culture. Whereas if you think about something like the social credit system, it's very much associated with a centralized state, the Chinese context, even an authoritarian state. So these things seem to be very much apart from each other. But I think they have certain things in common, and that's also where my theoretical interest comes from. All right. So this is a bit like the structure of today's talk. I will start with a short introduction, and I will explain why I think it actually makes sense to make a turn. Well, not a turn. Well, this is like just a fancy word, but just to start looking at civic virtue. Then I will introduce the type of framework that I've been developing of civic virtue and how it relates to technological change. And finally, I will look at, like, more concretely at some technologies or technological systems and how they mediate different modi of civic virtue. Oh, wait. So let me start very broadly. I think I'm not sure to what extent you are familiar with this field. As you said, Erik, there's actually very great diversity of disciplines in the room. But my field is, well, broadly speaking, philosophy and ethics of technology. And within this field, and maybe its contours, there have been certain major developments in the last so many years, decades. So we come actually from what is called the empirical turn. So the empirical turn is characterized by modern day philosophers who were responding to what is called the classical philosophy of technology. So people like Heidegger and Ellul, where the argument was, well, we actually have to become more empirical. We have to look more at the empirical reality of concrete artifacts. Look at what the things do, so to say. But actually, at the moment, we see that there is a little bit of a backlash against this empirical turn, in the sense that now there's a movement back to matters of a more kind of ontological, systematic importance. And I will explain in a minute why I think that is the case. The second thing is that, well, the overall revival of virtue ethics, as many philosophers will know, is at least claimed to be the case. There's actually a really interesting paper recently that makes the claim that this was not the case. Whether or not there was a revival, there's a lot of people talking about virtue ethics in philosophy. But also in the field of ethics of technology, this has become the case especially since the book by Shannon Veller, and I'll also expound on that. So renewed interest in virtue ethics specifically. And finally, if we look at the broader contours, also studies that kind of link to philosophy and ethics of technology, but also come from sociology or anthropology, there's an increasing interest in the role of technologies in governance, which is captured by terms like ordinal citizenship, phrased by Marion Fourcade, or the governance by numbers, Hélène Supiot. So there are different people who are thinking about the way that technologies are reshaping governance at the moment. And these trends, they don't come out of nowhere. And I think it has to do in large part with with some developments that we see with regards to techno-political or political and technical systems that have been developed over the last decades. So first of all, since the empirical turn, so to say, there is an emergence of global socio-technical systems, which arguably the logic of which transgresses the functioning of the discrete artifacts. So, we can think about the internet. We can also think about, so to say, world computers like Ethereum. These systems. And this is, I think, also what has informed the recent kind of backlash against the empirical turn, which focuses really much on the level of the artifact, where there is much more of an argument now that while the system that there are these effects of systematization that we have to look at from an ontological perspective. Another thing is that there is, maybe paradoxically, a refocus from the masses back to the individual. So on the one hand, we see a great level of systematization, but that also allows actually the individual to be kind of at the center, at the focus point. So what we see, for example, with a thing like Cambridge Analytica, at least what it tried to do, is to micro-target individuals, so to tailor information particularly for particular individuals. And this, I think, has also triggered this renewed interest into how actually these larger technological systems mediate individual dispositions and how these two relate to each other, which, in part maybe might also explain why now there's more and more of an interest in virtue ethics. And finally, these combined trends, systematization on the one hand and personalization on the other hand, enable systems to partake in governance. So, for example, if you think about like the recent scandal around the Dutch childcare benefit, the Dutch childcare benefit scandal, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with this, but in this case, there were the Dutch tax authorities used a system to personalize fraud signals, so to say. So people were either deemed fraudulent or not. So here you can see that actually a system was used to personalize these type of judgments, which allows these systems to partake in governance processes. So, larger picture, now going to the core of the argument, which is that in this talk I will try to make the argument that I think civic virtue is a great lens to look at these transformations, and hopefully I can convince you of why this is the case. Okay, let's start with a part of the story that I started with, which is this recent turn to virtue ethics in the ethics of technology. So this has been largely driven by Weller's book, Technology and the Virtues, which has argued that rather than focusing on impacts of technologies or on deontologic rules to govern these technologies, we should actually focus on agential dispositions. So the virtues that constitute our character and how these are mediated by emerging technologies. And what Weller is trying to do in her book is to offer what she calls an ethical strategy for cultivating the type of moral character that can aid us in coping and even flourishing under the conditions of these new emerging technologies. And what she does is she takes a pluralist approach. So she doesn't only draw from Aristotelian ethics, but she also draws from Buddhist and Confucianist perspectives. And in her book, she does kind of two major things. On the one hand, she lays out different conditions for the cultivation of these technomoral virtues. And furthermore, she also lists like what she considers to be relevant technomoral virtues to consider in the current state of development of emerging technologies. However, even though this is a great start, there is also something missing, I think, and the literature kind of agrees. And this is something that is not only the case for virtue ethics, but this is also the case for technology ethics more generally speaking, which is that there is a kind of an insensitivity, even though that is currently being overcome, but there has been for a while an insensitivity to the political and organizational realities within which technology ethics is to play its part. So you could say, for example, like it's very nice to know that engineers working at large corporations like Google and Meta need to cultivate the right dispositions, but we cannot disregard the organizational dynamics that make this possible. Like it's not so straightforward to become a good engineer in a certain sense if you're working for such a large corporation, because there are different incentive structures that are influencing your dispositions, for example. And there have been people arguing that this political aspect has been missing altogether from the ethics of technology. For example, Johannes Himmelreich has quite convincingly argued that in all the debates around bias in data sets and fairness, there's actually very little consideration or there's very little debate concerning the political philosophy behind these problems. And this also has a particular impact on the way that these issues are discussed in the ethics of technology. And the same counts actually for virtue ethics. So Don Howard, in responding to Shannon Feller's book, has said that she focuses really on individual ethics, but thereby she kind of disregards the civic virtues of citizens who live in political communities, so who live in these political organizations that themselves also influence their dispositions. So this made me wonder, like, okay, how can we overcome this? And I think civic virtue is the right answer. This is a kind of an easy answer, perhaps, even if you go back to Aristotle. So in Aristotle, you have this very interesting trilogy, one could say, the rhetorics, the Nicomachean ethics, and the politics. I won't discuss the rhetorics now. This is a very different, other different aspect, which I think is very interesting. But so in the Nicomachean ethics, Aristotle famously coins the notion of moral virtue, which is a disposition, but it's not any disposition. It's a disposition that aims at the realization of eudaimonia, which is the final end of human existence, so to say. And this is all well and fine in the Nicomachean ethics because it's really about a human anthropology. It's about, like, what's the final end of the individual human, so to say, of Dasein, one could say even. But in the politics, this is problematized, where Aristotle argues, well, the virtue of the good citizen is not necessarily the same of that as a good man. And the reason for this is that even though moral virtue is grounded in, so to say, the absolute end of the individual, the absolute end of human existence, civic virtue isn't. Because it is relative to the constitution, it's relative to the political organization in which it is taking its shape. This also means that civic virtue is kind of an in-between disposition. It sits in between the need to be effective in being ruled. So once we are citizens, we need to be ruled in certain ways. We need to, for example, be able to pay our taxes. We need to be able to show up for military duty, all these kind of things, depending on the constitution, of course. And we need to do these things effectively to be good citizens. However, that doesn't make us get rid of the moral component. So at the same time, there is still a place for moral excellence, but this moral excellence is also intertwined with the political reality. So here, moral excellence happens insofar as we are excellent in co-ruling, co-governing the political community of which we are a part. So this is where civic virtue shows its kind of interesting aspects of being not grounded in just the end of the individual human, but as an in-between disposition, because it is actually mediating between the end of the human or of the individual citizen and the end of his or her political community. So why is this interesting? For different reasons. First of all, kind of obviously, civic virtue does introduce this political dimension, because it is about mediating ethical dispositions and these it's about, like, how these political structures and institutions mediate also ethical dispositions. So it has this moral component, but at the same time, it places it within a larger political context. Secondly, this is not made explicit in many theories of civic virtue, but implicitly, this is very much the case. It already incorporates very much a concern with technological mediation. So, for example, in Philip Pettit, you have this talk about the intangible hand. In maybe more concretely in Sunstein and others, you have this talk about choice architectures. McIntyre talks about kind of this tangible tradition. Arendt about the public sphere. These are all technologically, in part, technologically constituted. So technology from the get-go plays a role in these theories of civic virtue. And I think it also, what it also makes it interesting is that civic virtue, because it retains this normative element, it can also help us, or it can also contribute to this, like, wider sociological and legal investigations of the governance or the transformation of governments under the conditions of emerging technologies, because it gives a normative frame to these discussions. It can tell us whether these transformations are actually desirable or undesirable. Okay, let me get to part 2, which is kind of a framework I tried to devise to capture civic virtue as I see it, how it mediates emerging technologies. So in doing this, I could go 2 ways at least. One way would be to take a theory of civic virtue, let's say New Republican theory, to run with that, reduce civic virtue to, for example, civility, and see whether civility is being cultivated or not by emerging technologies. I didn't choose that way for different reasons. I mean, there's actually also a more elaborate philosophical reason, which has to do with my engagement with Paul Ricoeur, which I can very briefly go into this, but it's too much of a distraction maybe. But Ricoeur, in his work, A Time and Narrative, discusses the tension, so to say, between different conceptions on temporality and philosophy. So he says, well, you have, on the one hand, you have the phenomenological enterprise, culminating in Heidegger, where temporality is grounded in Dasein, who is confronting its being towards death, and he says this actually fails. Ultimately this phenomenological getting to this purely phenomenological notion of temporality fails. However, its critique is still very, very valid. So its critique of ordinary time, one could say cosmic time, is still valid. So what Ricoeur argues for, I think, in this work is that actually there is no way of reducing temporality to either of these modes. And why is this related to civic virtue? Well, here we can draw from Hannah Arendt. So Hannah Arendt has famously posited civic virtue as related to what she calls political action. So even though she proposes a pluralist understanding of civic virtue, this is still quite a reductionist understanding. So it's like, as long as it contributes to political action, it is civic virtue, but it's easily corrupted because it kind of is mediated by other modes of human activity, especially work or labor. And I think, but because she still holds on to this phenomenological reductionist account of temporality, which I think going through Ricoeur in this detour, we can get rid of. So that means it opens up a framework in which a pluralist account is actually possible. I haven't fully done that yet, but I think I can provide you with the contours. So from one side, I am approaching it from the notion of temporality. From the other side, I'm approaching it from some of the basic questions that each theory of civic virtue tries to answer. For example, how are citizens motivated to cultivate their civic virtues? How does this cultivation happen? And what are the structures, so for example, the political institutions that contribute to this cultivation? And here I think there are three different modes to be distinguished, which also correspond to different traditions in thinking about civic virtue. So first of all, there is the path-oriented civic virtue. And why is it path-oriented? Because I think it draws from what we might call a reputational memory that citizens hold in order to cultivate their civic virtues. So for example, Philip Pettit has this notion of civic virtue as civility, which basically entails that citizens are engaged in a decentralized, non-intentional, continuous tit-for-tat game, one could say, a reputational game to uphold a certain level of beneficence towards one another. This is what Pettit then calls civility. And the structures that cultivate this disposition is what he calls the intangible hand, which is, of course, very much related to Adam Smith's invisible hand, but they're not focused on economical exchange, but actually reputation building. So through distributed and non-intentional tit-for-tat interactions, we get a sense of civic virtue that is spread throughout the population, which then supports the institutions that Pettit wants to propose, which promote freedom in the sense of non-domination. So this is one mode of civic virtue that we want to look at. Another one is mostly presented by people like McIntyre, which draws very much from the classical understanding, I think, of civic virtue, where it is considered a civic excellence, so to say. So and here also the idea is that ultimately the aim of the practices that citizens engage in virtuously also has to coincide with the general aim of the community. So this, or the tradition, as McIntyre calls it. These civic virtues then, which are enabling citizens to be excellent, are cultivated through practices that inform, or that are informed by what he calls standards of excellence. And these standards of excellence are transmitted to citizens through a narrative that is captured by a tradition. And this narrative is also materialized. So it's embodied in, well, real institutions, like, for example, civic education, which gives us, which informs us about the standards of excellence that we can use to inform our practices, by means of which we cultivate our dispositions as citizens. So this is like a second present-oriented mode of civic virtue. The third one, we can mostly, and here we can mostly draw from Hannah Arendt, is a future-oriented sense of civic virtue, where civic virtue is related to what she calls this anticipatory sense of political action. And here there are no past standards that can inform our virtuous behavior. Rather, acting virtuously means to take the initiative as a citizen, acting in concert with others, which is for Arendt is the only authentic exercise of virtue, as she calls it. But still, this also needs to be sustained. It's not like it doesn't happen out of a vacuum. So there is actually a political, technological context, technopolitical context, which in which this happens, which is captured by her notion of the public sphere, which includes the laws of the city, for example, which also includes elements such as architecture. So this is also where technology does and does not come in, because Arendt is kind of very skeptical of this element. All right, so this is like a bit of an overview of, like, so we have these three different modes of civic virtue: past-oriented, present-oriented, and future-oriented. Do we have a bit more time, Eric, to go to the last part? Okay, great. Okay. So, okay, this all sounds still relatively abstract, I would say. So how does this actually help us to think about technology and technological systems? So I will go through three different cases to make a claim that it helps us thinking about these things. So the first are reputation systems. I mean, reputation management systems have been implemented. We encounter them now all the time. Like, we have review sites. Like, whenever you go to Airbnb or to Uber, like, if you're a cab driver, you're being reviewed. If you are a passenger, you get a review. There are vast systems online that manage our reputation, and this is already comes from the 90s, when Pierre Omidyar started eBay and actually created one of the first widely used reputation systems. And he also said explicitly, these are meant to give praise where it's due and to make complaints where appropriate. So you can already see, like, these systems are meant to create a sense of civility, but not in our ordinary interactions as citizens on the street, for example, but actually online. So to what extent do these systems succeed in doing so? Well, to some extent, probably they do, actually. So if we look, for example, at this notion of civility that Pettit proposes, there is indeed some kind of tit-for-tat reputational game happening online between consumers, between providers, etc. So there is some sense of civility being cultivated through these online reputation management systems. And sometimes this is even done decentralized. So I think the case that is maybe most interesting, this is also where my interest in blockchain technology comes in, is where there are zero knowledge reputation systems, where you don't have to actually reveal your own identity, but you can keep your reputation as kind of a token, which you can access through private or through a key, which you can exchange with others without having to reveal your identity, which in a way makes it as close to this notion of civility as one can get. Like, you can be anonymous in a civic society, where interactions actually happen in a sort of decentralized way. However, as Pettit also says, this only works as long as the kind of infrastructure that supports this reputational game is also an intangible infrastructure. And what he means with that is that it is both completely decentralized and that people engage in interaction non-intentionally. So, for example, I engage with people on the street, and there is an invisible reputation game happening, but I don't intentionally do this to gain reputation. And this is, of course, is very different from the online environment. First of all, distributed systems as well, like centralized or distributed systems, are regulatory technologies. They have built-in rules that already govern the reputation management that goes on between citizens online, one could say. And furthermore, reputation management is very much done intentionally. So it's not an accidental byproduct. It's actually intentionally done in order to either gain or lose or protect one's reputation. And this, according to Pettit at least, confronts us in these systems with a certain threat of domination, where these large socio-technical systems, socio-technical systems, confront us with a kind of non-freedom, a threat of domination, where our civility is not something that spontaneously arises out of non-intentional interactions, but is actually prefigured by means of these systems. So there we already have one potential problem that these systems confront us with. Then going to social credit, I can give you a long story about social credit because I did quite some research on that. But to keep it short, social credit was actually devised as a way to introduce credit scoring to China, like plain financial credit scoring, in the 90s, and in the early 2000s, it was more integrated into the ideological frame of the Chinese Communist Party, where it was also linked to this notion of ruling the nation with virtue, or governance by virtue, which meant that actually it was broadened up to not only be about financial creditworthiness, but also to include, a sense of moral education in China, to include this idea of the good citizen as a product of this system. And it has been implemented at the national level through a creation of a general database and a linking of blacklist and red lists. But there also have been city pilots, for example, where there are rather explicit systems where you get so many points and you can lose them or gain them if you behave well or badly. And it has also been implemented in the commercial sphere, for example, through quite famously Sesame credit applications, where it's very much kind of an alternative credit scoring mechanism. So it's not one thing, it's kind of an umbrella of things, so to say. But what's interesting about it is that it does try to bring out, whether it succeeds or not, it does try to bring out this notion of moral excellence. The idea that by means of such a system, we can actually create good citizens, not just good consumers. And in that sense, it tries to approximate, at least, this present-oriented civic virtue. So by presenting a sort of system for civic education. However, when we then take this kind of McIntyrean understanding of civic virtue, we quickly run into a problem. Because in order for civic virtue to be rightly cultivated for McIntyre, the practices that citizens engage in should aim at internal goods rather than external goods. And external goods can be so much as, for example, material benefits or reputational gains. However, the social credit system itself is built on the logic of external goods. So it derives from a kind of history of shared rules, so shared or actually enforced, so to say, standards for good and bad behavior. And these then translate into a system of carrots and sticks, which constitutes external goods. So, for example, people would act virtuously, they would start helping their neighbors, but not because they want to help their neighbors, but because they want to gain certain reputational gains, or they want to gain certain access to resources, which can also be political resources. And what lies at the back of this is that if indeed there is this kind of crowding out effect of where intrinsic motivations are crowded out by extrinsic motivations, there is an underlying threat of conformism in these systems. And maybe in the Chinese system, this is not completely a surprise because it is placed within an authoritarian context. But as we also argue, or as I argue in the paper that's related to this, it's not just about China, but this type of system is actually transported or to other parts of the world as well. So this is something that we have to confront ourselves with. Okay, finally, and then I will briefly then wrap up the whole thing. So then I'm also actually interested in the other side of the coin. So where you could say like, okay, reputation management systems, things like the social credit system, these are kind of, you know, the dark side of technology. They're governed by these big social media companies or even by an authoritarian state. But I'm also actually interested in looking at open source politics, especially now Audrey Tang and Glenn Well, they have recently just published a book, Pluralism, in which they outline kind of a very emancipatory idea about how technology can help democracy. The idea that as they frame it, I think we can program democracy into our technologies or something like that. So there is a huge hope for these kind of things. So democracy is a technology, like any social technology, it gets better when more people strive to improve it. And I think there's a very interesting tension here, because I think I really applaud the idea, but at the same time, I wonder to what extent they can actually realize what they want to do, which is basically build an Arendtian public sphere, you know, a sphere for public for political action. So to approximate this kind of future-oriented civic virtue that Arendt tries to, or that Arendt talks about through these decentralized systems for co-decision making. And my argument here is that actually there is a threat that should be taken into account, even in these more emancipatory systems, which is that even these systems they have there is a ubiquitous use of cybernetic feedback mechanisms, for example, ranking or voting mechanisms that make sure that information is sorted, that voices are unequally heard, so to say, in order to get from, you know, the large debate to a single decision. And here it could be said that the public sphere in this case has an agency. It is actually interfering into the political action. So where, for example, in Arendt, the public sphere is kind of static. It doesn't interfere with political action. In these platforms, it does. It directly interferes with political action, and thereby it can also undermine its capacity for initiative by going from this larger debate to, for example, to a single decision. So here there is a threat, even in these more anticipatory systems, for what might call like apolitical action. So even though they are developed for political action, there is a threat of apolitical action. So I hope this gives a little bit of an idea of how these different theories of civic virtue can help us think about very particular challenges that arise with these different forms of emerging technologies that are being developed right now. And I'm really happy to hear your thoughts, and would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Wessel. Thanks. That is a lot of food for thought. And unsurprisingly, Moshe has the third question. But before we go there, I have a very short question, Wessel. In the beginning of your presentation, you alluded to probably a critic of AI ethics, saying that they were actually not dealing with ethics. Can you let me know who that was, or do you remember what I mentioned?
You mean Johannes Himmelreich, who wrote the paper that
This was Himmelreich, and that wasn't clear to me.
Yeah, Johannes Zimmer actually wrote this paper,
Okay.
Ethics of Technology Needs More Political Philosophy.
Okay. Excellent.
But
All
there
right.
are more people who made similar claims, like Pak Hang Wong also made a claim that that there is too little interaction with political philosophy in technology ethics. Even though, of course, in the last few years, this has been somewhat addressed. I mean, so these are,
Yeah. All right, Wessel. Thank you very much. Moshe, floor is yours.
Thank you for this comprehensive overview. There was a phrase that I expected to hear and I did not hear, and I wonder how it fits into your overall scheme, which is the phrase common good, public good, greater good.
Mm-hmm.
How does it fit in in this overview of civic virtue? The commitment to the common good, where does it fit in?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, there is a allusion to the idea of a general will. I mean, the common good, it is very much discussed in political philosophy, but it's more of an outcome of political or of it's more of an outcome of kind of an idealized political system than that thing which informs it. So, I mean, if we would for example, if you take the Rawlsian perspective, you know, like you have a political system which respects the principles of justice, which has certain which implements a certain procedural idea of distributive justice, then the outcome of that would be that it would respect the common good by virtue of the way it functions. So
I have actually I think you're turning things around. If you look at the U.S. Constitution, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, which is a roadmap for democracy at least in the history, clearly a roadmap for democracy. But what is the preamble of the Constitution? It says the purpose of the United States is to promote the common good.
Mm-hmm.
The rest is a mechanism by which we collectively reach agreement on a common good, because your idea of the common good and my idea of the common good and Viola's idea of the common good and Klaus's idea and Eric's idea, they're all going to be maybe different. So how do we reach agreement as a society on what is the common good? But if you read the first paragraph of the Constitution, the purpose of the United States is to promote the common good. The phrase is not there. It shows up actually in some of the talks in the Constitutional Convention that it was to promote the common good. So I think it's not an outcome. It's actually a driving force, a commitment to the common good.
Yes. So, well, I mean, the Constitution of the United States itself is not a political philosophy, of course. So, I mean, it also advocates for to enable the pursuit of happiness of each citizen, but it doesn't per se offer us a good framework to think about the pursuit of happiness. So, I mean, I at least I don't know of a political philosophy that starts out with the notion of a common good, and then from there goes to first principles. I mean, of course, like the U.S. Constitution has been very much influenced by the Republican tradition, and if we mean with a common good the idea that a political community has an end, then you know the telos of a political community, maybe that is the thing that we are also talking about. Then there is a big resonance with what I was trying to say about civic virtue, because civic virtue does indeed mediate between the end of the political community, which you know might be a way to say the common good, and the end of the citizen.
That's the tension that's built in some sense, right? This tension between the individual pursuit of happiness and the collective pursuit of happiness, that's a tension that every political system has to navigate. And it's also, you know, this is one of the issues in the US Constitution, right? On one hand, they said this is the purpose is the public defense, you know, things like that. But at the same time, you have the amendments that protect individual rights. So this is a tension that's built into any democratic political system, is a tension between the common good and individual rights.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Maybe we can continue the discussion later on.
Yeah. Move on. Let's move on. Thank you.
Klaus.
Yeah, my question is also a little bit about this tension, because you have presented this quote or strange quote that democracy is a technology, and you have. I don't. I've not understood what you have meant when you have criticized it a little bit, but I have not understood. I think what's your problem with it? I have a deep problem with this quote, because this individual rights feature, I think, is even the most important part of democracy. And if someone speaks about democracy as a technology, then this this feature can disappear, can completely disappear. So what was your critique?
Well, the critique derives very much from this Arendtian idea that in order to have democratic political action, we do need a public sphere. But for Arendt, for example, also when she discusses the law, she compares the law with a wall. So the wall around the city, which circumscribes action, but which does not interfere with action. And that's how that's how it can actually support political action, because it does not interfere. But when it comes to these co-decision making platforms, they all have these functions of, for example, ranking proposals, sorting through information, filtering information from a larger discussion to a singular decision. So it does interfere very much with political action, and that's why, at least from this viewpoint of Arendt's viewpoint of for future-oriented anticipatory political action, there is a tension there. These platforms actually undermine this capacity to some extent. That is a critique, basically.
Thank you, Wessel and Klaus. I think that was a good answer. There are two questions in the chat, which I would also like to point out. There's one by Luis Moniz Pereira. Would you please comment on the precise mathematical models of the evolutionary game theory with respect to your topics?
I'm not sure whether I mentioned any evolutionary game theory. I'm assuming that you mean here the work by Philip Pettit. Well, so Philip Pettit, he discusses, of course, these what he calls his economy of esteem, and these reputational tit-for-tat mechanisms that lead to the creation of beneficence or civility, as he calls it, between citizens. But he's not himself a mathematician, and neither am I. So there are no mathematical implementations of these ideas in his work. So in that sense, I'm afraid I cannot elaborate on that at this point.
Thank you. That's all right. There is another question by Alireza Sebi. As you mentioned, these systems usually try to shape the virtues of the individuals and society. I didn't understand exactly what kind of active treatment citizens can do with this work of governments, because many of these governments do not consider any civilized procedure to handle the protest or feedback of the citizen towards this kind of confrontation.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So here it's more about okay, now we know the problem, but what can we actually do about it? Well, this also very much depends on the setting, I would say. So when it's about, for example, the Chinese context, I'm not hugely optimistic that citizens can definitely have a strong voice in trying to change the way that systems like the umbrella policy and systems related to the social credit system actually function. But for example, when it comes to the last category of systems I discussed, for example, these that inform the digital democracy initiative in Taiwan, I do think that there is quite a lot of room for maneuver, where citizens where these initiatives themselves are set up to be co-decided upon. So here citizens can, the way I understand that is being done in the Taiwanese context is that actually the center focus is still face-to-face meetings between citizens. So there are these town hall meetings where people actually can discuss, for example, the conditions under which these systems are being designed, and these then feed their information into the platforms. So that is a potential way in which you could also influence the design of these systems. But indeed, the larger entities are affected, the more difficult it gets. For example, like, I mean, the first example I gave is the Dutch childcare benefits scandal, where it took a long, long time for citizens to have any influence on the process, where they had to go to the court, and the court didn't listen. Then the parliament was not answered by the government, so the government didn't answer crucial questions coming from the parliament. So this was like a huge nightmare, and I don't have a direct solution to this problem, except for working towards a different type of political ideology that takes the role of technology more seriously, I think, than what happens currently in most, for example, political parties. But apart from that, I don't have a very good answer to those kind of type of cases.
Thank you, Wessel. Final question in the chat by Willy. I guess you half answered it already, but what about the increase in bureaucracy for a technology-supported civic virtue?
Okay, so yeah, so that's also a very good question. So I'm not necessarily advocating to use technology to mediate civic virtue. The main point I'm trying to make is that whether or not this is in the first place a good idea depends on the context of human activity that we're looking at. For example, when it comes to reputation management online, it does make sense to have some kind of system in place. And it doesn't need to be a matter of bureaucracy here, because a lot of these platforms are actually operated by commercial entities. But when it comes closer to political action, it becomes actually very questionable whether you want to use any technology to mediate civic virtue, whether you actually maybe at some point want to have a technology-free environment, as are, for example, most of our parliaments still to a large extent, where there is still this possibility of acting in concert in a face-to-face interaction. I mean, I might be a little bit of a Luddite in this regard, that I think that is actually, in many cases, very much preferred.
Thank you, Wessel. I think, as I said before, this is a lot of food for thought, with some rather, I would say, very strong basic arguments as well. And I think that's the purpose of good philosophy. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I believe we have heard some very good points that we should consider maybe also in the future. I would like to conclude the session here. Now, as I said before, we will have a piece by Wessel as music. I should defend him and say that this was not his idea; it was actually my idea. And I also suggested the piece simply because it has the title "New Chaos Theory Leviathan." Wessel, maybe you want to say very briefly what this song is about.
It's not the deepest ideas that go into this. I think it's a song I made towards the end of my PhD, so you can see what I spent my time on. And I always like to have some kind of philosophical background for the song. Leviathan, it kind of speaks for itself. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about it. Well, you can hear for yourself. I haven't made music for a while now, but now recently I just started another group here in Hamburg, so now we're making music again. But
excellent.
That's nice.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll listen to it. Final word. The next event in our series on June 11 will be on generative AI degrades online communities. The speaker is Gordon Birch from Boston University. It'll be moderated by Enrico Nardelli from University of Roma, as you certainly know. And without further ado, I'll try and play the song. Let's see how this works. Thanks for coming, and be back on June 11 to join us. Many thanks again, Wessel, for both the music and of course, the talk.
Thank you very much, Erik. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Wessel. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.